Thank you, everyone, for coming. The lecture that I have for you today is drawn from, and at times might seem like a synopsis of my latest book, Love What Lasts. When we're talking about the literary canon, we're talking about something which has lasted. I would say that almost no matter how you define the literary canon, no matter where you find yourself in the debate, that the canon is something that has lasted. And so there's a number of ways in which the subject of the canon, or the very idea of the canon, is kind of at the heart of Love What Lasts, which is really a book about taste as well. It's a history book. That's the way that I have described the book to people that don't read blog posts or anything like that. I describe it first and foremost as a history book. It's a history of art before and after the French Revolution. And the book also draws a pretty sharp distinction between cultural artifacts that last indefinitely, which I call uncommon things, cultural artifacts that last a lifetime, or about 75 years, 3 generations, which I call common things, and then mediocre things, which are things that are wildly popular, very sensual, and come and go very quickly. The canon, the literary canon, is a slightly different issue. It's a separate issue than just broadly considered things that last. And so in this lecture, I'd like to talk about the canon not just as a bunch of things that lasted, a bunch of books that lasted, but as something a bit more specific. The canon is literature, and Love What Lasts is concerned not only with literature, but with film, food, fashion, all kinds of cultural artifacts. In the last year, classical Christian educators have begun openly debating one another about the literary canon. And I find this debate a genuine relief. For quite some time now, the classical Christian movement has presented itself as far more single-minded and unified in purpose than it really is. It is a movement that has made a habit of regularly, robustly celebrating itself and its accomplishments, its power, its numbers, and its importance, all the while blithely dismissing its own internecine strife as mere growing pains. Publicly musing on classical Christian education's numerous failures, shortcomings, and dissensions will rather quickly get you labeled as an ingrate and a perfectionist. As the debate over the canon currently stands, I'm not content that anyone has put forward a clear presentation of what the canon is, where it comes from, what the standards for entry are, and what privileges and rights are conferred on books which have entered the canon. How do you know a book has entered the canon? How do you read a canonized book differently than an uncanonized book? These are difficult questions because the canon is such an odd thing. There's very little in the world which is really like it. The literary canon is, on some points, similar to the biblical canon, and yet it is also far more amorphous and unstable than the biblical canon. Nonetheless, it's real. The literary canon is sort of like masculinity or femininity, which is to say it's hard to define exactly, and yet we must try. The fact there are aspects of the canon which are difficult to speak about with precision doesn't mean that the whole thing is up for grabs. Homer and Virgil are definitely in the canon. Charlotte Bronte is in the canon, but not as certainly as Homer and Virgil. There's less debate about Jane Eyre than Huckleberry Finn, and there's less debate about Huck Finn than there is about Maya Angelou or Cormac McCarthy, whose works are still quite recent and may end up being replaced by similar but better and more universal works at some point in the next century. Like the biblical canon, the literary canon is simply a list of unusual books. And what makes them unusual is their power over us. There are different versions of the biblical canon because the Orthodox have a list of canonized books, as do the Catholics and the Protestants. The Coptic Church has a longer canon than anyone else. While there are different versions of the biblical canon, the Catholic canon is stable and reliable. No matter what Catholic church you enter, the canon's the same. And this is true of the Orthodox as well, and Presbyterians and Methodists and so forth. The literary canon is not nearly so predictable. And this is because there is no equivalent in the academy to a council of bishops or a presbytery. When it comes to the literary canon, there's no fixed list. It's not as though Notre Dame has their own canon, Harvard has its own, the Sorbonne has another. Rather, there are certain books whose presence in the canon is the result of a broad consensus, while other books have a far narrower consensus, and others which are hotly contested. However, even for those books wherein there is a broad consensus, like Homer or Virgil or Dante, there is nonetheless no induction ceremony into the canon. There is no canonical sticker to apply to the cover, as there is with Oprah's Book Club or Robert Parker wine ratings. Now, given there's no induction ceremony, and given there's no actual list of books in the canon, the very concept of the canon threatens to dissolve in our hands. Does it mean anything? And if so, what does it mean? And if the canon exists, who gets to say what books make the list? And who gets to say who gets to say who? And if a book gets canonized, how do you know? What proof is there? What happens when a book is mistakenly canonized? How do you remove an unfairly canonized book? And how do you add a book to the canon which was unfairly passed over? While the analogy will not serve all our needs in sorting out all these questions, I think it best to understand the literary canon as a kind of inherited estate that has been passed down for many generations, perhaps like Pemberley. The canon is an estate which contains woods, lakes, rivers, but also cottages and stables and massive homes which are filled with beautiful things, some of which are quite old and some of which are not. When the estate passes from one generation to the next, most of it stays the same. The objects within the estate which are most likely to get sold are the newest, because they mean the least to the new custodian, and because they are the least vetted objects in the home. When I say they are least vetted, I mean the new custodian's father may have purchased a certain lamp for the library because it pleased him. But merely pleasing one custodian of the estate is not all that significant. If his son is pleased by the lamp, and his son's son is pleased by it as well, it means the lamp has been judged to fit with the rest of the decor in a way that makes it seemly to keep. After 4 generations, the 5th has neither seen the house without the lamp or spoken to anyone who has seen the house without the lamp, which means that all knowledge of the lamp's novelty is gone. It has become an old thing, absorbed into the estate as surely as the objects which have been there for longer. When a new custodian of Pemberley adds something to the estate, like a lamp, he knows that he personally is at liberty to decide against the lamp in a few years and to replace it with another one if he so chooses. He knows that his children have seen the lamp come into the home, and that it was selected because it pleased their father, and that it does not have deep sentimental value to him. He merely likes it. It's not a symbol of his loyalty to the family name, and he hasn't suffered to keep it in good repair. He simply thinks it's neat. As such, when his children inherit the estate, they will not feel bad about replacing the lamp with one that suits their tastes instead. His children can replace their father's lamp without damaging or changing the aesthetic of the entire estate. The wholeness and symmetry and harmony of the estate does not depend on the lamp, for it is done just fine for many years without it. If his children decide to keep the lamp, they do so because the lamp pleases them as well. If their children decide to keep it, it pleases them too. And after that point, the lamp begins to accrue a symbolic value, a spiritual value, really, that makes it harder and harder to get rid of. It is transformed from a thing which merely pleased their father into a thing which represents the family, a repository of the family identity. If the Pemberley example is a little too distant, allow me to use a different analogy, one which you may have personally experienced before. Suppose a man paints a picture of a tree in his backyard, frames the painting, then hangs it on the wall in his study. The painting is one of a dozen different decorations in the study, though the man rarely uses his study, and neither do his 3 children. His children come of age, strike out on their own, and when the man dies 50 years later, his children pack up his things. None of them is particularly fond of the painted tree, for it did not hang in a prominent place in the home, and the children never observed their father gaze at the painting with satisfaction. Nonetheless, they all feel embarrassed to throw away something their father made by hand, even though it means little to them. So the oldest son puts the painting in a box, marks the box Dad's things, and then puts the box in his own attic. 50 years later, the oldest son dies, and his children begin dividing up his possessions. For many years, they have known that a few boxes of things which formerly belonged to their grandfather were stored in the attic. But they were never particularly close with their grandfather, so they never felt the need to investigate the contents. Upon the death of their father, though, they sort through his father's things, their grandfather's things, and come across the painting of the tree. They have never seen the painting before. It obviously didn't mean all that much to their father, and so they're free to get rid of it without feeling remorse or betrayal. If they decide to keep it, they will only do so because the painting is good, not because they feel a sentimental obligation to hang on to it. Now, I tell this story as an illustration of the fact that it is impossible to create an heirloom. Heirlooms emerge. Heirlooms are revealed. Heirlooms enter into reality as a synergistic agreement between good people and good things. Bad children will not retain good things. They'll sell them. And good children will not retain bad things. They will throw them away. Heirlooms are thus a little bit beyond our control. We cannot force an heirloom into existence, which is what makes heirlooms a little fearful. In a manner of speaking, heirlooms will themselves into existence. The heirloom has a spiritual power that we are obedient to, which is why we feel guilt when we sell an heirloom. Some objects are capable of retaining the spiritual essence of those who touch them. In this, an heirloom is sort of a secular relic. It's a relic that doesn't heal broken bodies, and yet it does press down upon us the heavy burden of a glorious identity, which is capable of inspiring people to virtue. What is true of heirlooms is true of all lasting traditions as well. Just as it is impossible to create an heirloom, it is impossible for a man to create a tradition. Traditions create themselves. When I refer to lasting traditions, I mean a tradition that is handed down across multiple generations. Your family might have a tradition of watching It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas, and the tradition might be 10 years old. But at that point, it's still not really a tradition. A tradition is something which is both received and given, which means that it requires at least 3 different parties, 3 generations. If I receive and give a certain tradition, it means I receive it from one party and give it to another, which including me makes 3 parties. Traditions are inherently Trinitarian. The third party, the one I give the tradition to, has no direct contact with the first party, whom I received the tradition from. Traditions are thus inherently priestly as well, in that they connect what is seen with what is unseen. If the third party keeps the tradition alive, it does so in faith that the second party was a faithful witness to the first party. As you can see, a family's tradition of watching It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas doesn't yet rise to that level. It can be very satisfying anyway. It can be far more satisfying than picking a new movie to watch every Christmas. But it's impossible to create from scratch a tradition which your grandchildren will certainly perpetuate. When I say traditions create themselves, I mean traditions are a little bit like holidays or holy days. Men cannot create holy days. We can merely acknowledge that they have emerged in our presence. Most holidays are concerned with beginnings or endings. We celebrate the beginning of Christ's life. We celebrate the end of his life and his birth from the dead. The church has historically celebrated Mary's birth and death as well, and John the Baptist's birth and death. Because God is the source of all things, every beginning and every ending involves an opening, a touch point between heaven and earth, which is why beginnings and endings are holy. In the beginning, every soul traverses the cosmos from the empyrean to the womb. And in the end, every soul traverses the cosmos back to the empyrean to be judged. Of course, human lives are not the only things which begin and end. Institutions, cities, and nations begin and end. They are born and they die. We ritually celebrate their beginnings in order to keep them from ending. Similarly, we cannot force great men into existence. We cannot force great institutions or great nations into existence either, because greatness only comes from God. Because of this, we cannot create holidays. We can merely acknowledge years later that on a certain day, the veil that separates the immanent from the transcendent was held back. And for a little while, someone or something divine was with us. What is true of holidays is true of heirlooms and traditions as well. We must be the caretakers of these things, and yet they are also our caretakers. Truth, beauty, and goodness are not things we have made, they are things which have made us. Accordingly, traditions are not mnemonic devices which exist to help us remember. Traditions do not lose their meaning. Portals into heaven close either from disuse or our disgust with them. We do not empty traditions of their meaning, for we do not give traditions their meaning. Traditions give us meaning. Traditions do not lose their meaning, we do. Much of the recent debate over the literary canon has treated the canon like some sort of discrete object which we have made. And because it's ours, we can either decide to keep it the way it is, or we can decide to change it and edit it and finesse it. But this sort of belief reduces the canon to a purely rational thing. As with holidays, heirlooms, and traditions, the literary canon is more of a phenomenon than a creation, which means the canon has its own nature. Just as lions have their own lion nature, roses have their own rose nature, and stars have their own starry nature, so the literary canon has its own nature. The Roman poet Horace once said, "You may drive out nature with a pitchfork, but she keeps coming back." Which is to say that nature is not like an inviolable, smooth, black monolith. Rather, nature is a little malleable. It's like a Nerf football. You can contort it and twist it out of shape, and yet, as soon as you let go of it, it resumes its original form. If you attempt to drive out your own nature with a pitchfork, you will irreparably damage yourself, and you will ultimately fail. Likewise, no one really needs to worry about the canon getting altered. The people who attempt to alter the canon may harm themselves and their students and their institutions, but the change will only be temporary. You cannot decree a change in the canon any more than you can decree a new tradition. Such things last only if they have power which is independent of the one who declares them. There are no accidents in the canon. There are no mistakes, just as there are no accidents and mistakes in a lion or a rose or a star. Everything which has been said thus far is a mystical consideration of the canon, and yet there is also a very practical and very human side to it. On a mystical level, the canon has a good deal in common with holidays, heirlooms, and traditions, and yet explaining the canon is far more difficult because of how amorphous it is. Returning to Pemberley for a moment, The Iliad and the Odyssey are comparable to forests and lakes. Plato's Republic is a river. The city of God and the Divine Comedy are the residence itself, the roof and walls and splendid door. Whereas works like Anselm's Proslogium, the Consolation of Philosophy, are the dining table and the best silver cutlery. There are also many objects which are too precious to get rid of, but which are not needed at this time, and may lay dormant for many years before being dusted off and reappraised for proper use. New items arrive from time to time, some of which last for a generation or two before the estate finally turns them out. So too, there are some books which last long enough to enter into the outskirts of the canon, but which upon being tested according to canonical standards are ultimately found wanting. I'm thinking of books like Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott and The Adventures of Huck Finn by Mark Twain. For a brief period of time, these books found their way into the canon, and yet they could not support the burden of it. This often happens when a book is between 100 and 200 years old. We're impressed by the fact it has lasted and that anyone still cares about it. And so we treat it with the respect due every old thing, and yet the book is still young enough that we don't feel all that guilty for asking if the book has truly deserved to last this long, or whether some miscalculation has been made. The canon shifts its weight. It undulates. It's a little open. It changes the way Pemberley changes, which is so slow that it's hard to really notice. There are a few books written in the last 50 years that will still be read 500 years from now, though it's impossible to say which ones. This year, you're going to buy a few articles of clothing that end up lasting a decade, but it's hard to say which ones. One of the first things a responsible steward of the canon must do is acknowledge that it is impossible to say which new things will last. For example, not a cinematic landmark. That's what Robert Frederick wrote in his review of 2001: A Space Odyssey for Variety magazine upon the film's initial release, April 2nd, 1968. Not a cinematic landmark. Also from the same review. The plot, so-called, uses up almost 2 hours in exposition of scientific advances in space travel and communication before anything happens. The surprisingly dull prologue deals with the advancement of man, centering on a group of apes. The makeup is amateurish compared to that in Planet of the Apes. And get this, who's seen 2001: A Space Odyssey? Okay. An important prop is also introduced, but so sketchily that many viewers will scarcely note and promptly forget it. A huge black monolith is shown briefly, to reappear light years later as the key to possible life on other planets than Earth. Writing for the New York Times, Renata Adler said, 2001: A Space Odyssey was, quote, so completely absorbed in its own problems, its use of color in space, its fanatical devotion to science fiction detail, that it's somewhere between hypnotic and immensely boring. Upon its release, Pauline Kael described 2001 as, quote, a monumentally unimaginative movie. Writing for the New Republic, Stanley Kaufman described 2001 as, quote, a film that is so dull, it even dulls our interest in the technical ingenuity for the sake of which Kubrick has allowed it to become dull. Suffice to say, upon its release, 2001 was a near total critical failure. Time has changed our perspective, though. In 1995, the Vatican named it one of the 45 greatest movies ever made. In 1999, The Village Voice named it 11th on a list of the 250 greatest films of the 20th century. In 2008, it landed at number 43 on the Guerres du Cinéma list of the 100 greatest films ever made. In 2015, the BBC listed the film as the 4th greatest film ever made. In 2022, last year, the Sight and Sound Directors Poll, which is conducted among 480 current film directors, and in terms of film criticism, is the most prestigious list you could land on, named 2001: A Space Odyssey the greatest film of all time. It is quite remarkable what the passage of time ultimately proves. The things we think will last don't. The things we think won't last do. Here's a couple other quotes. You've heard all of these before, but I feel like this is the right place to trot these out. Quote, "We don't like their sound, and guitar music is on the way out." That's what the Decca recording label said when they declined to sign the Beatles in 1962. Quote, "Television won't last because people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night." Movie producer Daryl Zanuck in 1946. In 1893, Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, was asked if his invention would make war terrible, more terrible, and he responded, quote, "No, it will make war impossible." When the Paris exhibition of 1878 closes, electric light will close with it, and no more will be heard of it. Oxford professor Erasmus Wilson. I could go on. History is littered with failed predictions of this sort, the 20th century in particular. As the pace of popular culture has accelerated, so has our desire to say with great certainty what will happen next. When I say the pace of popular culture, I mean our cultural metabolism, the rate at which we burn through new ideas and new things. The sort of people who are desperate to make pronouncements on the future tend to be rather bored with the past. For the past has a tendency of sorting out who was right and who was wrong. 2001 is, without a question, the best film of 1968. Pretty much no one knew that at the time it came out, though. But the only sort of person for whom that's a problem is the sort of person who is obsessed with the present. For the sort of person who doesn't really care all that much about the present, who doesn't care about being fashionable or popular, the fact it takes 50 years to really sort out which movies are the best isn't a problem. Once a man resolves to obey the Apostle Paul's command to, quote, "be very careful how you live," and do everything you can to redeem your time, the fact he doesn't know what's popular these days doesn't bother him. Like the Apostle Paul, he regards these as evil days. What's true of movies is true of books and music as well. If you're willing to give up the social capital which comes from being in the know, you can get a very high return on your time. If you want to be thought in the know, you have to be willing to waste most of your time looking for good things no one's heard of. If you want to have a definitive opinion on the 10 best movies of 2023, you're going to have to watch a lot of movies that come out this year, most of which aren't very good. If you want to be in the know, you don't regard these days as evil, as did St. Paul. The sort of person who wants to be in the know regards these days as very important and believes this to be a time of great change and promise, a time when things are finally coming together or when they're finally falling apart. After all, who would want to be in the know about things that didn't really matter? Committing yourself to the canon, to reading it, studying it, and teaching it, means giving up on quite a lot about what the world considers to be important. You can't want to be important and want to understand John Milton at the same time. There are people who want to have it both ways, of course, and who want to merge studies of the canon with fashionable politics and trendy ideas. It's this sort of thing which has made humanities programs worthless and rightly gotten them gutted. The honor of canonization is simply that of being taught in classrooms which profess allegiance to tradition and convention, classrooms which give a vote to their ancestors. Aristocratic classrooms, in other words. Students are convened in such classrooms not to criticize and share their opinions, but to listen, to learn, to convalesce, to be rehabilitated, and to be reformed. The only books and music and works of art appropriate to such classrooms are good and true and beautiful. And the most reliable and most objective criteria, not foolproof, not at all, but the most reliable and most objective criteria in determining whether a thing is good and true and beautiful is whether it has lasted. Things do not last unless they have their own reserves of power. Nonetheless, old books require explaining. Old wise books are opposed to the evil age in which we live, and this means they need their defenders. Old wise books are old wise men lost in Gomorrah after dark. Their power is not physical, but spiritual. If we defend such books with our lives and our careers, they will defend our souls with their wisdom. Children learn to respect old truths and old beauties by watching powerful, loving, fearful, authoritative adults respect and glorify old truths and old beauties. If a book requires no explanation and needs no defense, it does not need canonization. If a certain institution does not claim to defend old truths and old beauties, then it is not concerned with redeeming time from an evil age, and it really has no say on canonization. It can do what it likes. When I go to church, I expect to hear the gospel preached. I expect to see the body and blood of Christ given to the holy. I do not expect these things when I go to a movie theater. When an institution claims to be Christian, we must demand that it do Christian things and say Christian things. When an institution claims to be classical, we must demand that it do and say classical things. And if an institution claims to be classical but will not do and say and defend old things, then it should be called out for vampirically feeding on the popularity of the classical Christian movement without being willing to suffer the condemnation that comes from resisting an evil age. Classical things require a teacher to make sense of them, to defend them against the spirit of this age, and to preach them and to venerate them and to glorify them by adoring their wisdom. Students do come to understand them, and yet classical things are really the sort of things one is initiated into. That's what a teacher of the canon does. He initiates his student into these things. It's more of a baptism than an education. As opposed to saying the canon gives students a certain body of knowledge, or that classical education merely gives students a certain method for thinking, I believe it's more fitting to say our goal is to pass on to our students a certain spirit. It is a spirit which is critical, but not defined by criticism. It is a spirit which prefers beautiful things, but is not hedonistic. It is a spirit which is capable of analysis, but does not regard analysis as the highest reach of intellection. It is this spirit, what I'll simply call the classical spirit, but which could also be called the canonical spirit, I suppose, which the teacher aims at giving students. It is not merely a body of knowledge, not merely a method of thinking, but a way of being. The classical spirit is acquired only through humble attendance to the classical canon: Homer, Virgil, Augustine, Dante, but also Bach, Mozart, Rembrandt, Plato, Jane Austen. And yet the classical spirit lingers beyond the ability to summarize the arguments of Plato or the poetry of Homer. It is this spirit which may last until the student dies, still faithful to God. This spirit is a solution to the problem of the zeitgeist, the spirit of our age, the evil days in which we live, according to St. Paul. Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, the apostle teaches the Ephesians, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Therefore, don't be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. The classical spirit is a way of being careful how you live. It is an habituation of making the most of the time you have. These are odd, vague expressions if they are not understood in the context of evil days or an evil era. Redeeming the time is an interesting turn of phrase which St. Paul more or less equates with being careful how you live. Being careful how you live means getting a high rate of return on your time. You can exchange your time for many different things. You can exchange it for sleep. You can exchange it for money, for pleasure. You can exchange your time for $10 or $20 or $100. You can exchange your time for a little pleasure, for modest pleasure, for great pleasure. You can exchange your time for daylight or for nightlife. You can exchange your time for solitude and reflection and for prayer. And St. Paul said you need to live carefully so that you get as much for your time as possible. You need to get as much for your time as you can stand, as much as you can handle. It's hard to make the most of your time because you live in evil days. The desire to be important, to be known and loved and admired constantly threatens our need to make the most of our time. We live in an evil era. This was true when St. Paul said it thousands of years ago. It is true today. There will always be something at play in the world, at play in the human heart, which tempts us to get as little in return for our time as possible. Old ideas offer a vantage point from which new ideas can be evaluated. The man being hustled from one fashionable idea to the next may sense that the latest ideas are unreliable and fleeting. But unless he has a stable place to stand that is outside the flow of culture, his objections to the hustle won't be based on anything other than feeling and suspicion. It is not enough to realize new ideas don't last and don't work. Unless a man knows of older and better ideas, he may despair that any ideas work. A classical education offers rich and varied proof that there is something outside the whirl and chaos of fashions that now drive our culture. Some ideas do last. Some beliefs do prevail over time. Some convictions are strong enough to survive the centuries. These ideas, as they are known in books and music and images, are the canon. We do not reveal them or declare them, they slowly declare themselves. The canon as a thing is inextricably bound up in the classroom as a place. If there were no classroom, there would be no canon. The classroom is a place for the canon. Similarly, if there were no church, there would be no Bible. The Bible is simply what the church speaks. The literary canon is what the priest of the classroom speaks. The more non-canonical material which is taught in a classroom, the less a classroom that classroom becomes. Likewise, the more a church departs from the word, the less of a church it is. A certain church may slowly abandon the word and maintain the name of Christ, but only for a time. Eventually, the community of Christ will throw that church out, and the church will, in the world, become a byword for fashion and subterfuge. Likewise, an academic institution may claim the title of classical or Christian, and yet these claims must be borne out through painful fidelities which run contrary to the evil days in which we live. Canonical things last because they bear a true witness to God and human nature, neither of which change, despite our desires to dismiss what the past teaches us about both, so that we can create a naive optimism favorable to our present goals. We return to canonical things century after century because they are still right, even though they are not widely accepted or celebrated. Canonical things remind us of our limits and our frailty, and the fact that any cultural project worth undertaking will only reach fulfillment after we have passed from this life into the next. For the impatient modern man, lasting books are a distressing reminder of what our ancestors thought, said, and did in order to create the modicum of stability that we, their enlightened grandchildren, now use as a rallying point from which we can march to their graves and desecrate their corpses. A love of canonical things, of things which have lasted, entails a deep distrust of the latest promises that poverty, violence, oppression, and bigotry can be cured if we would only liquidate what little remains of tradition and custom. A few gullible conservatives can always be found who think the latest utopian promises are authentic. Thus, those who are faithful to lasting things must regularly endure accusations from friends and foes alike that the whole world would be happy if they would simply give up their absurd obsession with the past. Anyone who defends old things along these lines is bound to encounter the naysayer, who points out that the works of Homer and Bach and Shakespeare have not always been old, and that when the Goldberg Variations debuted, it was not regarded as anything other than pop music. However, the glory of Bach depends not only on the transcendent beauty of his music, but the costly preservation of this beauty over time. Every heirloom was once a common household item. But the fact it was once common proves nothing. Traditional things invariably come from non-traditional origins, just as most holy things come from secular origins. The test of time not only proves the spiritual mettle of a thing, it also sort of creates that mettle. Most things are fathered by time and then vampirically devoured by time a little while later. But canonical things have synergistic relationships with time. Anyone who claims a certain heirloom is just a quilt or just a clock is incapable of looking beyond appearances. Those who dismiss the Goldberg variations as the pop music of Bach's day do so to justify the shallow musical styles of their own day. No one who loves Bach or who understands history at all would call Bach the Lauren Daigle of his day. If you listen to Lauren Daigle, fine. Just be willing to admit that you need better taste in music. What does a right understanding of the canon mean for the classroom? What does it mean for the state of classical Christian education? First, if classical educators are not primarily giving their students a body of knowledge, but a spirit, then we need not constantly worry about the curriculum being on the level of the students. Again, we're giving students a body of knowledge, and we do not need to worry about the curriculum being on the level of the students. Again, we're giving students a body of knowledge. That is part of it. And we do need to worry about the curriculum being on the level of the student, but these are not ultimate concerns. They're concerns, but they're not ultimate. They're lesser. If you're a good and pious Protestant and you want your children to be good and pious Protestants when they grow up, you might be better served reading Martin Luther's 95 Theses to them, or having them read it when they're in 4th grade, than in giving them an illustrated children's book about the Reformation. The actual 95 Theses are more likely to confer the Lutheran spirit than a book which is easy to understand. When they are grown, pious Lutherans proudly say things like, "I read the 95 Theses when I was in 4th grade." They do not proudly say, "I got a history lesson about the Reformation when I was in 4th grade." That's really nothing to be proud of. That's pretty average. When you're old, you want to know that you've been fed the good stuff from a young age. That's the giving of the Spirit right there. That's what keeps you loyal. My daughters are really only interested in old movies and old TV shows, and that's because I've pretty much only shown them old movies and TV shows since they were kids. I showed them Cary Grant movies, Audrey Hepburn movies, Grace Kelly movies, Jimmy Stewart movies, before they could understand the plot and the dialogue. But they could understand the clothing and the manners and the behavior. You have to give children the good stuff before they can really understand it. Second, the dispute over the canon is another significant piece of evidence that classical Christian education has reached the point that someone needs to write a manifesto. In the early years of every popular movement, there is a great degree of confusion about what the movement actually is, what its adherents believe, and what its ambitions are. This is true of everything from Lutheranism to communism. Before some sort of orthodoxy is established, a young movement contains self-professed admirers and participants who give wildly different accounts of themselves, and the movement threatens to fall apart for lack of direction or clarity. It's for this reason that Luther and Melanchthon wrote the Augsburg Confession in 1530. The Holy Roman Emperor wanted to know who exactly he was arguing with and what the argument was. Up until that point, there was no clear arbiter of Lutheranism to its Catholic opponents. For the same reason, Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. The famous first line of that book, quote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism," neatly elucidates the problem of every young, wild, popular movement. And that's ambiguity. Today, we recoil from the word manifesto because we immediately think of the Communist Manifesto. But a manifesto is simply a necessary document in the early stages of any social cause that's going to last more than a generation. The Communist Manifesto clearly articulates communist belief. It draws the line, and it does so in clear terms. The final chapter of the Communist Manifesto is not particularly famous, but it was very helpful in defining communism. In the final chapter, Marx calls out all the movements, associations, clubs, and ideologies which claim to be communist and aren't. He draws clear lines. These people aren't communist. They wish they were, but they're not. They don't deserve the title. These people are. A manifesto is a tricky thing because there's no way of forcing it to work. A manifesto has to catch on. The power of a manifesto has to come from within, from its charm, its power, its coherence, and people must be voluntarily drawn to it. For every manifesto that works, there are 1,000 documents claiming to be manifestos which no one cares about. Just look up manifesto on Google. Or on Amazon, sorry. Nonetheless, classical Christian education needs a manifesto. I nominate David Hicks to write it. It really needs to be someone who is wise, someone who is experienced, but also someone who's a little bleak about our odds of succeeding. Only someone who's a little bleak can go all out. Optimists save too much for the swim back, as Vincent Freeman once put it. When I heard David Hicks last year refer to classical Christian education as a noble but losing battle, I've never been more proud to call myself a classical Christian educator. Third and finally, I'm eager to not be misunderstood, and so I want to reiterate that a good education does involve the translation of a certain body of knowledge, and that classical Christian graduates ought to know where and when the Reformation began. And they ought to know that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, and that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And they ought to know all these things, even though their public school counterparts probably know all these things too. At the same time, if classical education is more concerned with bequeathing students the classical spirit than with conferring them with mere knowledge, then this ought to be apparent in the way we conduct class, in the way we discipline our students, in the way we choose what art projects they undertake. If you spend 20 minutes walking around a teacher's store or an educator's store, and you look at the sort of decorations you're expected to buy, most of them are in service of conferring a body of knowledge. If you walk into St. Patrick's Cathedral, though, or the Metropolitan, or even if you just walk into a nice department store like Barney's, you immediately know that the place does not exist to confer a body of knowledge. All these places in their respective ways are established to convey a spiritual purpose. If a classical school isn't doing the same thing a public school is doing, it shouldn't look like a public school. It shouldn't feel like a public school. If someone watched a recording of your school day on mute, would they know it was classical? Would they know it was Christian? You'll find words on the walls of St. Patrick's Cathedral, but you really won't find information. You'll find art on the walls. You'll also find symbols. Inside the cathedral, you'll find candles and bells, chanting, singing, vestments. You find order, ceremony, ritual, tranquility, reliability, rigidity, and formality. And that is how you transmit a spirit. Thank you very much. A few minutes for questions. Sir?
Raise your hand if you have your question, and we'll bring the mic to you for the live stream. Thank you.
Of the canon, but not the neo-classical Christian educators, the Oxfords and Cambridge and Harvards, basically deconstructing the canon. What can be done about that, or what is your comment on that?
I think that they destroy themselves. I don't know that they need to be chastised or punished from the outside. I think that when you start abandoning things that last, you cease to last as well. And so I think that those, formerly glorious institutions with tarnished glory these days, will eventually intellectually spend themselves out of existence. And so I don't know that anyone needs to come in and condemn them, or that they need to be, chastised in papers and in blog articles and that sort of thing. It's enough if you're wary of them, if you don't send your children there, if you don't expect much from them, and if you hope for the best and hope that better minds turn those places around and restore their former glory and their former purposes. But I think, was it Nicholas Gomez de Villa? He was quoted, I think, one of Wes's lectures, the modern world doesn't need to be punished, it is the punishment. And that's true. Other questions?
Since you're closest.
So I think that when you wrote an article and you were giving the analogy of the uncommon, the common, and the mediocre, you used like meals.
Yeah.
So is mediocre like McDonald's?
Mediocre would be like fried tacos from Taco Bell.
Common, everyday meal.
Ham sandwich.
Uncommon, now we're on a feast or a banquet.
Right.
So what does that look like for a classroom? I think we would all understand mediocre as the things nobody really ought to be reading, or it's like snack food.
Yeah.
But is there common great works, and we only ever delve into the uncommon?
No, I wouldn't say that. I don't want to. Anyone who follows my work knows that when I'm talking about the classroom, I'm really talking about the high school classroom. I almost never talk about the elementary classroom. When I talk about the elementary classroom, I talk about pedagogical strategies of elementary school classrooms that would work in high school classrooms too. Like, that's my main interest. So you're not giving fourth graders Paradise Lost, and you shouldn't. So the books that you give to elementary school students are probably just common books. They're probably in the 75, I don't know, maybe the 50 to 100 year range, or they might even be more recent than that. I think the place for common books is book clubs. I don't think that common books have no place in society or something like that. I mean, I write books that I'm hoping are common, that I hope make it that long. I would be very content to write a book that was read 3 generations from now. I'm not going to write. That's just an incredible fantasy anyway. But I think that common books deserve places in reading clubs that people start, maybe in electives that are kind of set apart from the demands of old things that we impose on the classroom. I think that a book like Cormac McCarthy's The Road is an ideal book club book. But it's not old. It doesn't have the glory of some bygone generation that's been handed down forever. It's still up for debate. It's still up for criticism. So I don't think that putting it in the classroom is wise, because the classroom really needs to be set apart for the things that have lasted. So, this is a question you probably get, every classical educator gets. Like, why do you read such hard books? Why don't you read books that students can understand? Well, because they're going to read those books on their own. Like, the kind of books that you want someone to teach your kids are the books that they can understand on their own. Otherwise, the teacher has no purpose for being there. And I don't want to, I've ragged enough on 20th century literature in classical classrooms. I don't need to do that again. But I'm sorry, I just don't think, that you need to spend your precious classroom time on a book like The Old Man and the Sea. I'm not saying it's a bad book. I'm saying you can understand it on your own. And if you can understand it on your own, then read it on your own. Someone is far more apt to read The Old Man and the Sea on their own than they are to read The Consolation of Philosophy on their own. And if people are not giving you The Consolation of Philosophy or The City of God and saying, this is good, read this, you're probably not going to read it. Like, way more than 95% of the people that read Paradise Lost last year read it because they had to. Whereas plenty of people read 20th century works because they want to. So I look at the classroom, I think of classroom time as very precious. You have to treat it like this non-renewable commodity. Nothing should cost more per ounce than classroom time. And because classroom time is not renewable, homework time is, It's a potentially endless supply of homework time, whereas classroom time is like, you got to treat it like, I don't know, the rarest mineral there is. Because the things that are taught in the classroom have so much more weight, and because they require an explanation, and because they need defending. So, I mean, I love Hemingway. There's plenty of 20th century authors I love. I went back to my hometown a couple weeks ago and stayed up late with my friends talking about Ottessa Moshfegh's novels, which I adore and which are being written right now. So it's not like, I know, like, given my, my total body of work, I can sound like this complete curmudgeon. It's like, if it's not old, it sucks. But that's really not it. My concern is more for protecting classroom time than it is for cutting out people that write new books. Other questions? Thank you.
To just kind of go back to the literary canon versus the biblical canon, you mentioned that the biblical canon is very stable, and then you just kind of glossed over, the Catholic canon has these books, the Orthodox canon has these books, the Coptics, the
Right.
Protestants, but each of those segments of Christianity have a different canon.
Right.
And so how do we, is one right? I mean, obviously, if you belong to one of those headings, you're going to say yours is right.
Sure.
But if we're going to do that, and then we're going to, set that next to literary works,
Right.
I don't know what to do with all that.
Well, first of all, the stability of a church's canon is born out of the government of that church. So there's no government of classical education in the same way. So the canon, as it's determined by a Catholic church, is determined by Catholic authorities. And that's a pretty significant difference between the biblical canon and the literary canon. There's, you might say that Homer and Virgil have wide acceptance, but the wide acceptance of Homer and Virgil as canonical authors, I would say, is a bit different than even saying something like St. Mark's Gospel has wide acceptance, even though everybody who believes in the Trinity is going to accept St. Mark's Gospel. St. Mark's Gospel doesn't have, it doesn't have wide approval. It's got approval from many different church governments, which is very different than having wide approval. The canon, I would almost say the canon of the literary canon is more like the recognition of saints in the early church, that it emerges out of this popular demand. So in the same way that you have people in a certain region that are saying something like, yes, I prayed for so-and-so's intercessions and I was healed. And there's this growing popular demand that a certain saint be recognized. I would say that the literary canon is more like that than the biblical canon in terms of the way we mark its boundaries. I'll take one more.
I had a question about how you would treat history.
Yeah.
So, we can say there's a medieval age, there's a Renaissance, there's a modernism, there's a postmodernism.
Sure.
And now we're trying to define, are we meta-modern? Are there works that would fit into the canon? And then, if so, Edward Gibbon's The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, how would you treat history in a classical classroom?
That's a fine question. Or other history books, say Two Lives of Charlemagne, or something. You mean any kind of history book as opposed to epic poetry or fiction or something like that?
Yeah, because history in and of itself is a narrative.
Right.
That over time you might say, oh, that's a bad narrative.
Sure.
That is kind of the way people see it.
Yeah, that's true. And there certainly is a more technical side to history than to epic poetry, in a way that makes in a way that makes history more like science than epic poetry. And so there may be very old science books that are still read, but they're read in the light of what's happened afterwards, which is not really true of the way that you read a philosophy book. Like, philosophy is not contingent on future discoveries being made or not made, whereas history is. So a history book could ultimately be shown to be wrong in a way that Pride and Prejudice is not going to be shown to be wrong. Like, you could argue that there's a portion in Pride and Prejudice where Jane Austen does not give a faithful, plausible description of human character and the way that people behave. Sure. But I don't think that that argument, if you want to make it, is based on recent studies show. Whereas recent studies show has far more purchase in the realm of history and science than it does in philosophy. Recent studies show has no purchase in philosophy or theology. Theology is right or it's wrong. Whereas history and science, the humility of science is that it's always up for debate. Whereas love your neighbor and love your enemy as yourself is not up for debate. So it's a fine question, and I would say it would be necessary to have a kind of some kind of bracketed category off to the side in the way that we treat old history and old science books, in a way that we don't need to qualify the ongoing authority of a book like City of God or Augustine's Confessions. Thank you all very much.